Welcome back, everyone. It feels like it's Christmas morning with this video. We have the timeline of European history. Now, European history, could have you could argue this begins in so many different ways. It seems like we're going to begin this after Charlemagne. I feel like this is like the continuation of so many conversations. Like, when does the Europe begin? Is it the Minoans? Is it Rome? Is it Greece? What is it? I think we're talking specifically like modern European history. So let's jump into it. Glad you're here as always. Let's go.
Today I'm going to go through our new Timeline of European History chart. As you can see, this new version was designed to match the style of our timeline of world history. But unlike the world history one, which starts at 3300 BCE, the Europe one starts at 843 CE.
So like towards the high Middle Ages ish, the Middle Ages to today.
Now, obviously, humans were living in Europe long before
Yeah.
843, but when it comes to countries that we know today, such as England, France, Germany, and Russia, the 9th century is a pretty good place to start.
Okay.
If you want to get a copy of this new chart as a poster, you can do so right now by heading over to usefulcharts.com or by clicking the link in the description or pinned comment.
Go get you a poster.
Okay, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get to it.
Birth of European kingdoms. 843 to 1066. Okay, I see you useful charts with your segments now.
At the start of the 9th century, there were really only three highly developed civilizations in Europe: the Islamic Emirate of Cordoba in Spain,
And that's crazy to think about. That's Europe. Yeah, that's Europe.
the Empire of Charlemagne, Charlemagne being the guy who claimed to have resurrected the Roman Empire in the West,
Yeah.
and the Byzantine Empire,
Yeah, can't forget them.
which was what remained of the Roman Empire in the East.
Yep.
Everything else was under the rule of either petty kings or local chieftains. For example, England at the time was divided into a bunch of different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and in what is today Ukraine and Russia, the East Slavs had arrived but had not yet created a formal state. Now, the reason why this chart begins in 843 is because that's the year that the Empire of Charlemagne was divided between his three main grandsons
That mean he the year he died?
in what's known as the Treaty of Verdun. Charles the Bald received West Francia, which would go on to evolve into France. Louis the German received East Francia, which would go on to evolve into Germany.
Yeah, kind of easy to remember. Louis the German.
And Lothair inherited Middle Francia,
Italy.
which would be further divided just 12 years later. So 843 is basically the starting point for both France and Germany, arguably two of Europe's most important countries. But like I say, Middle Francia didn't last long. It was quickly divided into Lower Burgundy, basically the Provence region of France, the Kingdom of Italy, which was actually just northern Italy,
Like Cisalpongao.
and Lotharingia, which included the Low Countries. Of
Like Netherlands?
these three, Italy was the most important, as well as the most fought over, as it came with the title of emperor. It was during this very turbulent time in Italy that the Saeculum Obscurum took place, a sort of dark age for the papacy when it was controlled by a single corrupt family. Over in East
What family was that?
Francia, the Carolingian dynasty quickly died out, resulting in the monarchy becoming an elective position instead. At this point, the region of Upper Burgundy became independent, eventually merging with Lower Burgundy. However, East Francia gained Lotharingia instead, and then, even more importantly, Italy. Thus, in 962, the Kingdom of East Francia and the Kingdom of Italy united to become the Holy Roman Empire, a state that would exist for the next 844 years.
And that's arguably, as we always say, Otto the Great, kind of where that starts.
The first emperor being Otto the Great. Then, a little while later, under Conrad II, a third kingdom was added as well, the Kingdom of Burgundy. So,
Just basically siphoning out power
in
and
the end,
land.
all three parts of Middle Francia ended up being combined with East Francia. As for West Francia, well, the Carolingians eventually died out there as well, resulting in a nobleman named Hugh Capet being elected king. His descendants, known as the Capetian dynasty, would go on to rule West Francia, eventually called France, for the next 805 years,
That's a big dynasty right there.
making it the most stable out of all the royal dynasties of Europe.
Wow.
Okay, let's now jump over to the Byzantine Empire
Let's
because
do it.
even though Charlemagne and his successors claimed to be the true continuation of the Roman Empire, the Byzantines claimed this as well. And in fact, they had the better claim, as the Roman Empire in the East never actually fell.
No.
They didn't even ever call themselves Byzantines. They were simply the Romans. The term Byzantine is just a convention invented by later historians.
Of course, the city of Byzantine or Byzantium was always there. That was just renamed. It was created in like the archaic age of Greece.
Anyhow, in 876, the Macedonian dynasty came to power in Constantinople, and this ushered in a sort of golden age for the Byzantines. For example, one of their early emperors, Leo VI, recodified Byzantine laws, and then later emperors reconquered Crete, Cyprus, Thrace, and Syria. Also during this time, the Bulgars to the north became Christian, and under their leader, Simeon I, built an empire that started to rival the Byzantines. However, the Byzantine Emperor Basil I
Was the Bulgar Slayer?
eventually conquered them as well, marking the peak of the Byzantine Golden Age. Another nearby people group that interacted with the Byzantines at this time were the Rus, who built a Christianized state around the city of Kiev. We'll come back to them in a bit, but for now, let's move over to Spain, which had been conquered by Muslims about a century before the start of this chart. There, the Emirate of Cordoba had been established, which eventually became the Caliphate of Cordoba. In the year 1000, Cordoba was likely the largest city in the world, not to mention one of the most advanced and cultured. However, to the north, a small Christian state known as the Kingdom of Asturias, which had held out against the Muslim conquests, started to expand under Alfonso the Great, eventually becoming known as the Kingdom of Leon.
Who will, of course, will absorb more and more land and power as the centuries go on.
Also, the nearby Basque people eventually formed the Kingdom of Pamplona, later known as Navarre. Under Sancho the Great, they managed to defeat Leon, and then after Sancho's death, the Christian areas of Spain were basically divided into 4 kingdoms,
That's where you get Castile and Aragon.
becoming Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Navarre. Now, before I move down any further on the timeline, there's one last area that we need to get caught up on:
Scandinavia.
Scandinavia and Great Britain. The 9th century is when the Viking Age really started to take off, with the legendary figure Ragnar Lodbrok being placed somewhere in that century. According to legend, it was his son, Ivar the Boneless, who led the Great Heathen Army in their invasion of England in 865. Like I mentioned earlier, England at this time was not united, but instead consisted of a bunch of independent Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Vikings conquered one
Yeah, I think this is where you call the Heptarchy.
of these in the north and set up the Kingdom of York there. In response, one of the Anglo-Saxon kings, Alfred the Great, united all of the other kingdoms so that they could better defend themselves. This is what set the stage for what would soon become the Kingdom of England, particularly after York was recaptured from the Vikings. But the Vikings had also established kingdoms in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. And in 1016, a Danish king known as Canute the Great
And technically part of Ireland.
managed to conquer all of England and eventually Norway as well, creating what historians nowadays call the North Sea Empire. But that empire did not last very long once Canute died, so England once again became independent, as did Norway. Now, I should point out that one area that was not a part of the North Sea Empire was Scotland. It had formed as a distinct kingdom when Kenneth MacAlpin conquered the Picts and basically united them with the Scots.
Free Scots.
Around the time that the North Sea Empire collapsed, there existed a real king in Scotland named Macbeth, upon
That's cool. That's cool.
whom the famous Shakespeare play was based.
Oh, really? Didn't know that.
Then, of course, there was the arrival of the Normans in England. The Normans were a Viking group that had invaded and settled in northern France
Yep.
back in the 10th century. But from there, they launched other invasions, most notably in southern Italy, where the Kingdom of Sicily was eventually established. And
Yeah, Sicily, and kind of like the two Sicilies, where you have like the island of Sicily, and then you have like eventually like the Kingdom of Naples down there, like at the bottom half of the boot.
of course, in England, where William the Conqueror arrived in 1066, winning the Battle of Hastings and becoming king.
Yep. Just like that, we're already through the Dark Ages, so now we're in the High Middle Ages, which I think, of course, goes into 1453, which is a very crucial moment, obviously, when Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Empire. But yeah, 1066, here we are.
Okay, let's now return to the two main empires so that I can set the stage for what's known as the High Middle Ages. One of the most important things that occurred during the Middle Ages was the Great Schism of 1054. You see, prior to this, all of Christianity in Europe was basically united as one big church. But in 1054, a permanent division was made, resulting in two separate churches: the Roman Catholic Church, based in Rome, and the Eastern Orthodox Church, based in Constantinople.
For now.
I placed this event here on the chart to make it clear that Kievan Rus ended up on the Orthodox side of the split, whereas the newly established kingdoms of Poland and Hungary fell on the Catholic side.
Yeah.
Now, ever since Otto the Great, Rome had been a part of the Holy Roman Empire, even though technically the Pope had been granted control of central Italy way back during the reign of Charlemagne's father, Pepin. However, after the Great Schism, Rome started to exert its independence, so much so that the Pope and the Emperor were often at odds with each other.
So this is kind of like where you get your papal state.
This is why, from this point forward, the papal states
Yeah.
are shown as being distinct from the Holy Roman Empire. Another key event that happened
Which I think is like from Ravenna to Rome.
around this time was the Turkish invasion of Anatolia. Following the decisive Battle of Manzikert in 1071, the Byzantines lost most of this territory to the Seljuks, who established a new state there called the Sultanate of Rum.
Yeah, Sultanate of Rum, which basically for like a ton of time, it kind of like in the backwaters of Anatolia, shadows the Crusades, and Kilij Arslan really like holds like, I wouldn't say hegemony, but holds like a crazy power hold on this region for quite some time.
Rome. This led to the Byzantine emperor at the time, Alexios I, to appeal to the Pope for help, which in turn led to the Crusades. The first group to be negatively impacted by the Crusades was actually the Ashkenazi Jews.
Okay, so we're going to do some good history here. So we're not even at the part of, you know, let's go through Constantinople and let's go to the Holy Land. We're going to talk about the pilgrimages. We're going to talk about the peasant crusade and so forth.
Who had settled in Germany during the time of Charlemagne. In fact, the word Ashkenazi is simply an ancient Hebrew word for Germany. However, these days, Ashkenazi Jews tend to be more associated with Eastern Europe. And this is because way back in 1096, they started to migrate en masse to Poland as a direct result of the Crusades and the persecution against them that they caused. You see, unlike most of Europe, Poland welcomed Jews and gave them special protections. Another thing that happened as a direct result of the Crusades was the increased use of coats of arms. They had already been invented, but it wasn't until the need for knights to be distinguished from each other that they really took off.
Ah, okay. Okay, so these, it also becomes, this is kind of also, that's a cause and effect, but also I would say it kind of coalesced with feudalism, lords, and that little distinction between the two, the lords and their knights.
So that's why it is at this spot on the chart that you suddenly see a bunch of coats of arms, one for each country. Let me now go from left to right and tell you what happened in each location over the next few centuries.
All right.
In Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, each country initially solidified their status as separate kingdoms, with Norway eventually adding Iceland and Greenland to their realm, and Sweden adding Finland. But then, because of several marriages between their royal families,
You're gonna get the is it Margaret?
around the year 1400, one monarch ended up ruling all three kingdoms, resulting in the Kalmar Union.
Yeah,
In
Margaret.
England, something similar happened. The Norman dynasty was succeeded by the Plantagenet dynasty, originally from Anjou, France, which, because of certain marriages, ended up controlling both England as well as about half of France. Thus, the territory they controlled is often referred to as the Angevin Empire, the famous three lions on the English coat of arms representing England, Normandy, and Aquitaine. But the Angevin Empire quickly crumbled, with France eventually taking back most of their land, leaving England to concentrate on the island of Great Britain instead. They had already taken control of much of nearby Ireland during the Anglo-Norman invasion, claiming it to be a lordship belonging to England. But their conquest was not complete, and by the 1300s,
Which originally I think was used to stamp out a lot of the Vikings, right? But then they kind of stayed.
the area they controlled was reduced to a small area called the Pale, with
Right. Which eventually becomes Northern Ireland.
several independent Irish kingdoms around it. It was a whole different story in Wales, though. There, Llewellyn the Great managed to unite most of the Welsh kingdoms into a single united principality. But then Edward I managed to conquer it, making Wales a permanent part of England.
And then he does the same with Scotland.
He then turned his sights on Scotland, and because they were in the middle of a succession crisis, he managed to exert control there for a while. But eventually, the Scottish regained their independence, and England once again set their sights on France, with Edward III claiming to be the rightful heir to the throne there, a claim that led to the 100 Years' War. Over on the Iberian Peninsula, the Caliphate of Cordoba was eventually split into a bunch of smaller states called taifas, which were then conquered first by the Almoravids and then by the Almohads, both from North Africa. And around the same time, Portugal emerged as a new Christian kingdom. Eventually, the main Muslim controlled cities on the peninsula fell to the Crown of Castile, the last Muslim holdout being the Emirate of Granada, which lasted until 1492.
Dang. And just like that, 1492, like 1492 to 1493, not 1492, the 1400s. We just saw so much history in the 1400s.
France, during this period, was heavily involved in the Crusades, with the French kings Louis VII, Philip II, and Louis IX all being personally involved. After this, France became tied up in the 100 Years' War with England, which they eventually won around the time that Joan of Arc got involved. Note that I've labeled France during this period as Valois France, because when the main line of the Capetian dynasty died out, it was replaced by a junior branch known as the House of Valois. In the Holy Roman Empire, it was the House of Hohenstaufen that was in charge during the High Middle Ages, which is when the empire reached its peak of power. The most famous Hohenstaufen emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, is shown here, but it was actually his grandson Frederick II who ruled over the most territory, as he ended up inheriting the kingdom of Sicily. Eventually, though, Sicily became independent again and was subsequently conquered by Charles, the brother of King Louis IX of France. But then that kingdom was split into two, with the mainland portion being referred to as Naples and the island portion as Sicily.
So the two Sicilies become one Sicily.
Anyhow, when the Hohenstaufen dynasty ran out of male heirs, the Holy Roman Empire entered a period known as the Great Interregnum, in which there was no emperor for 62 years. This was then followed by
That's like 2 generations of no emperor. That must have been an interesting time.
a period in which the House of Luxembourg held the imperial crown most of the time. It was during their tenure that Europe was hit with the worst pandemic in all of world history, the Black Death. with many cities losing over 50% of their population.
Can you just imagine the turmoil?
It was also during this period that the papacy moved from Rome to Avignon, which is nowadays located in France, but at the time was located in the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, let's now go back to the Byzantine Empire and continue down the timeline there. When we were last over there, we saw how the Byzantines had lost most of Anatolia to the Seljuk Turks. Well, soon thereafter, they lost Serbia and then eventually Bulgaria as well. Then, during the Fourth Crusade, they even lost their capital city, Constantinople, at least temporarily. Basically, a bunch of Latin crusaders took over the city and ruled it as the Latin Empire for 57 years.
I really haven't we haven't talked about that because we haven't really studied it. So that's an interesting little piece of history right there.
At the same time, a different group of crusaders, known as the Teutonic Knights, set out from Germany and tried to Christianize the Baltic tribes. They didn't manage to conquer Lithuania, but they did capture other territory and thus established the state of the Teutonic Order. But pretty soon there was a different enemy to worry about.
The Mongols.
Because during the 1230s and 1240s, the Mongol invasions reached far into Europe, ravaging Bulgaria, Serbia, the Rus, who had now divided into two main states.
And not to mention non-Europe, which is just entire Middle East and Central Asia. It's just ravaged.
Lithuania, Poland, and Hungary. As a direct result of these invasions, the Pope gave the title of king to Mindaugas of Lithuania, as well as to Daniel of Galicia-Volhynia, in exchange for their promises to help fend off further Mongol incursions. Around the time of the Black Death, a lot of changes took place in the landscape of Eastern Europe. Poland reunited, and after a brief union with Hungary, ended up uniting with Lithuania
And this is where you get the Lithuanian Poland. Is it the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth?
instead. Earlier, they had each captured land from Galicia-Volhynia. So basically, together, they were now the largest power east of Germany. But even further east, a new power was growing that would eventually overtake them, Moscow. You see, the main Rus city had moved from Kiev to Vladimir, and then from Vladimir to Moscow. Obviously, we'll be coming to Moscow later. But for now, let me point out a few things that happened in Southeast Europe. First, the Seljuk Turks were eventually replaced by the Ottoman Turks. Serbia flourished for a while, even calling itself an empire, but then it fell to the quickly growing Ottomans. Next to fall was Bulgaria, but then in 1453, we get what's probably the most important event on this chart so far.
Probably one of the most important events in human history was the fall of Constantinople, which made, it kicked off the Renaissance. It really didn't kick off the Renaissance, but Renaissance kind of festered and it kicked off simultaneously. But the interesting part about all of this is now you got to find another route, and this is colonization really kicks off in the 14th and 15th centuries. Sorry, not the 14th, 15th centuries, it's 15th and 16th centuries, and you get these great empires like Portugal, Dutch, England, Spain, XYZ, just going across the globe to search for whatever. And then, of course, gunpowder innovates at the same time, and that's where modern history really begins right here.
The official end of the Roman Empire after 1,480 years.
Yeah. The Renaissance. So Renaissance stops in 1618, which is the beginning of the 30 Years' War. Okay.
So the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans basically marks the transition point between the medieval period and the modern period. This is because the fall of Constantinople had two big consequences. First, it resulted in a bunch of Greek scholars and artists migrating from the former Byzantine Empire to Italy.
Oh, so it does actually, no. So actually it does have some connective tissue there. I'm glad we went over this.
Where they helped kickstart the Renaissance and scientific revolution. And second, it forced Western European countries to search for new trade routes to the east, which resulted in the Age of Discovery. Let's look at the Renaissance first, which started in Italy. One line that I haven't yet pointed out is Venice. Whereas most of northern Italy was at least nominally under the control of the Holy Roman Empire, Venice was not. It was an independent republic that had grown to become a sort of maritime empire.
Yes, and basically controlled so much of the trade and the Dalmatian area as well.
By the 15th century, both Milan and Florence were pretty much independent as well, both being ruled by powerful local families, the Sforzas in Milan and the Medicis in Florence.
That famous Medici family.
It was primarily in these three cities, as well as in Rome, that the Renaissance began. So it's here that we get figures like Leonardo da Vinci, who painted the Mona Lisa, and
Which is such a. I guarantee you. Now, here's a funny thing. I guarantee you, Leonardo da Vinci probably was like, who cares about the Mona Lisa? Now, of course, he liked it. Most likely, he painted it. But I mean, they found it in the attic. They found it in the attic of one of the houses he was in wasn't it French territory at the time or near the border of France? I'm pretty sure that's accurate. That's why it's in the Louvre. But isn't it insane that such a work of art just immortalizes you? But I think, the Last Supper is also very important for his works of art. Now, obviously Michelangelo, the Sistine Chapel, XYZ, like these guys are giants.
Michelangelo, who painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Let's now move over to Spain because that's the next place where a series of royal marriages led to a consolidation of power. To start things off, there was the marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, effectively creating a united Spain for the first time, although Aragon by then also included all of southern Italy, as it had conquered both Sicily and Naples by then. Next, the Habsburgs, who had recently just started their near-continuous 475-year reign as Holy Roman Emperors, also inherited the Low Countries due to Emperor Maximilian I's marriage to Mary the Rich.
So basically like Belgium and Netherlands.
But then their son married the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and therefore that couple's firstborn son ended up inheriting all of Spain, all of southern Italy, all of the Low Countries, and the title of Holy Roman Emperor. In Spain, he was known as Charles I, but in the Holy Roman Empire, he was known as Charles V. On top of all of this, Spain was also starting to build a colonial empire in the Americas.
Yeah, a ton of gold reserves. That's why it says the Spanish Golden Age. They are easily the greatest power in Europe.
So yeah, Charles V was pretty darn powerful. Externally, Charles V's main enemies were Francis I of France, against whom he fought several wars in Italy, and Suleiman the Magnificent, who was Sultan of the Ottoman Empire during its peak. But Charles V also had internal problems to worry about, as his reign coincided with the Protestant Reformation, and
this guy had a lot on his plate.
some of the states within the Holy Roman Empire wanted to convert to Lutheranism. Initially, he did not allow this, but after several revolts, he agreed to the Peace of Augsburg, which allowed each ruler to choose their own state religion.
Which becomes the status quo until 1618.
At the end of his life, Charles V decided to divide his domains between his son Philip, who received Spain and the Low Countries, and his brother Ferdinand, who received Austria and the title of Holy Roman Emperor. Thus, from this point forward, the House of Habsburg was divided between the Spanish branch and the Austrian branch.
And the Austrian branch probably is the most powerful. Probably.
In Spain, the Habsburgs eventually gained Portugal, creating the Iberian Union. But they lost most of the Low Countries when the Dutch Republic fought for and won its independence. Another country that gained independence in the 16th century was Sweden, bringing an end to the Kalmar Union. However, take note that Norway remained under the control of Denmark at this point. In England, after it lost the 100 Years' War with France, a new civil war took place, known as the Wars of the Roses.
We got to cover that. I can't believe we haven't covered that yet.
As two branches of the Plantagenet dynasty fought against each other. In the end, a new dynasty came to power, the Tudors, of which Henry VIII, famous for his 6 wives, was a member. When he wanted to divorce his first wife, he had a falling out with the Catholic Church, and hence the Protestant Anglican Church was formed.
Yeah, one thing you don't do is tell Henry VIII no, as many people have found out.
Around the same time, Ireland was finally conquered, but take note that it did not become a part of England, like Wales had, but was rather made into a separate kingdom, which happened to share the same king as England. But then, following the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the Tudor dynasty died out, and the House of Stuart from Scotland inherited both England and Ireland,
That's where you get James I, James VI.
meaning that the three crowns were united under a single monarch for the first time.
Yeah.
But before we proceed any further, let's go back to Central and Eastern Europe so that I can point out a few other things that happened during the early modern period. First of all, once again, due to certain marriages, the Austrian Habsburgs came to hold both the thrones of Hungary and Bohemia, in addition to the title of Holy Roman Emperor. Poland and Lithuania officially merged to become the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and they opted to have an elective monarchy rather than a hereditary one. Interestingly, the state of the Teutonic Order went in the opposite direction. They switched from an elective monarchy to a hereditary one, becoming the Duchy of Prussia, which was then eventually inherited by the electorate of Brandenburg. Finally, even further east, Ivan the Great, and then his grandson Ivan the Terrible, greatly expanded Moscow's territory, transitioning it into the Tsardom of Russia.
And this is where we get a Russian state that actually has power that they can exert in all of Europe. So now the 7 modern wars. Okay, let me see if I can name them. This will be fun. Obviously, there's a ton of freaking wars that happened in this time frame. So we got the 30 Years' War. We got the 7 Years' War. We have the Napoleonic War. That's 3. We have World War I, World War II. That's 2. That's 5. I mean, there's other wars, like there's the Franco-Prussian War. I guess we could count that, right? What else am I thinking about? I mean, am I missing a big one? I mean, do we count stuff like the Russian Revolution? Do we count stuff like the Spanish Succession? I don't know. Let's just watch.
Okay, we've now made it to the 17th century, which means that we have approximately 400 more years to go. During the next 327 years, there were 7 major wars that involved most of the great powers in Europe. Therefore, for the next little while, I'll be using those 7 wars as sort of an anchor to explain things. The first was the 30 Years' War, which, until the 2 world wars, was the deadliest war ever in Europe. It started as a religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics within.
Yeah, and we just did the entire, like, I think Epic History did a really good video on that. We reacted to. So if you haven't seen that, go watch that.
The Holy Roman Empire, but eventually ended up being a power struggle between the Habsburgs on one side and Sweden and France on the other, supported by the Dutch. France had had its own wars of religion, and although it remained mostly Catholic, it had eventually passed the Edict of Nantes, giving certain rights to Protestants. This occurred around the same time that the House of Valois died out and was replaced by the House of Bourbon, yet another junior branch of the Capet dynasty. Anyhow, there was no real winner per se of the 30 Years' War, but the Holy Roman Empire definitely came out much, much weaker. Not only was it less united, it ended up losing about 1/3 of its population, not just from the war itself, but from the famines and plagues that resulted from it.
And which war brings, but it just exacerbated it.
Spain also lost Portugal and any hope of reacquiring the Dutch provinces. In contrast, Sweden came out much stronger, as did France and Brandenburg Prussia, even though Brandenburg itself was still a part of the Holy Roman Empire. This set the stage for the era of German dualism, in which there would now be 2 German powers instead of just 1.
Yeah, Prussia, which eventually, of course, unifies as Germany, and then obviously Austria.
Prussia and Austria. One country that was not really involved in the 30 Years' War was England, along with Scotland and Ireland. Instead, they ended up having a civil war in which their king was beheaded and a parliamentary republic was set up instead. However, this did not last long, and 11 years later, the monarchy was restored, with England and Scotland eventually merging to become Great Britain. Another country that stayed out of the 30 Years' War was Russia.
Yeah.
They had just come out of their time of troubles, a period between the end of the old Rurik dynasty and the beginning of the new Romanov dynasty.
The Romanov dynasty, of course, we know them.
Under the Romanovs, Russia expanded all the way to the Pacific Ocean and would continue to grow in power while Poland decreased. The next
Poor Poland.
big European war was the War of the Grand Alliance.
I don't think we've talked about the Grand Alliance War before, so let's hear it.
This alliance, which was made up of Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire, was formed in order to counterbalance the growing power of France under Louis XIV, aka the Sun King, who saw himself as an absolute monarch and had revoked the Edict of Nantes, leading
Okay, so there's the status quo was uprooted.
most Protestants to flee his country. Once again, there was no clear winner in this war. Instead, just 4 years later, a new war began, the War of the Spanish Succession. This one was caused by the fact that the Spanish Habsburgs had died out in the male line, and therefore the throne of Spain had to pass to a female line. But there was a big problem. The most senior descendant in a female line was also heir to the French throne, meaning that Spain and France would be united, creating a new superpower.
Whoa. Whoa.
Thus, the same Grand Alliance from last time got together again to fight
Because the balance, it's all about the balance of Europe.
France. In the end, it was decided that the French heir's second-born son, Philip, would get Spain, so that France and Spain would remain separate. This marked the start
Just imagine that alternate history.
of Bourbon Spain, which remains in place to this day. Another result of the War of the Spanish Succession was that a new kingdom was created for the Italian House of Savoy as a reward for assisting the Holy Roman Empire during the war. At first, they were given Sicily, but this was then exchanged for Sardinia, a fact
So the big island nation.
would become important later. Now, while the War of the Spanish Succession was going on, there was another war happening at the same time between Sweden and Russia
The Great Northern War.
called the Great Northern War.
Yeah.
Russia, led by Peter the Great, won that war, which saw the power of Sweden decline and the power of Russia continue to grow.
Yeah, because then they get St. Petersburg, they get that port, they really start to build from that.
It was Peter the Great who built the city of St. Petersburg and transformed the Tsardom of Russia,
A beautiful winter palace, by the way.
into the Russian Empire. Poland also continued to decline, having lost much of what is today Ukraine to the Cossacks, an area that would eventually be absorbed into Russia. Also in decline at this point was the Ottoman Empire, although it would continue to exist for some time.
Yeah.
Now, at the same time as all these wars, a very important intellectual movement was happening in Europe,
The Enlightenment.
the Enlightenment. You see, advances in science had been progressing ever since the Renaissance, and this drove thinkers to rely more and more on reason and empirical evidence rather than on religious dogma. It also drove the common people to want more rights and freedoms, things that would take time, and in many cases, a great deal of violence, to ultimately achieve. Okay, the next major war, the fourth of the seven,
It's the Austrian Succession.
was the War of the Austrian Succession.
Yeah, huge with Maria Theresa. I think one of my favorite videos that we've done was from Old Britannia that talks about really how Austria adopted this secession crisis and just ran with it.
This time it was the Austrian Habsburgs that had died out in the male line, resulting in another succession crisis. But the war was also about two big rivalries. The first was Great Britain versus France, both of which had, by this point, built colonial empires in the Americas. The second was Austria versus Prussia. You see, by this
And this kind of culminates to the 7 Years' War.
point, Prussia was now a kingdom led by Frederick the Great, and it was becoming stronger by the day, starting to rival Austria as the main German power. So, just like in the last two wars, Britain allied itself with the Holy Roman Empire, whereas the French allied themselves with Prussia. In the end, the Habsburg line passed through Maria Theresa, but she ended up losing a lot of territory. She obviously was
Yeah, specifically to Frederick the Great.
not very happy with this, and thus a new war soon began, the 7 Years' War. But in between the two wars, something unique happened. The major powers in Europe switched partners.
Yeah, this is always interesting. So Great Britain aligns differently here than France does.
Great Britain now aligned itself with Prussia,
Yeah.
whereas France now aligned itself with Austria.
And it's all about alliances and handshakes and territory and deals.
This time there was a clear winner. In North America, New France was conquered by Great Britain.
Yes.
And in Europe, it was clear that Prussia was now equal to, if not greater, than Austria.
And of course, it's very important to also note that the new people over in Russia, like Catherine, and then maybe Catherine's husband before Catherine, aligned themselves with Prussia and aided Prussia in the help. I believe it was against Silesia.
Now, take note that so far, Russia hadn't really been all that involved in any of these
Until
big
now.
wars, although that would soon change. It was sort of involved in the last two, but only in a supportive capacity,
For Prussia.
not a main one. This allowed Russia to continue to get bigger, stronger, and richer. The late 18th century therefore saw the Russian Empire at its peak under Catherine the Great. It also saw Poland cease to exist altogether, with its lands being split between Prussia, Austria, and Russia. Now, ever since the Enlightenment, the desire for more rights and freedoms for the everyday person was growing. But when and how people actually got more rights and freedoms differed greatly by country. For example, in 18th century Denmark, they still had an absolute monarchy, due to this law here, whereas in Great Britain, they now had a constitutional monarchy, in which an elected parliament held a good amount of power.
So Robert Walpole becomes the first prime minister, like in 1720 something.
Well, France was one of those places where there was still an absolute monarchy. This led to the French Revolution, during which the
We know it, we love it. We don't actually love it because it was horrible, but yeah.
people cut off the king's head and declared a republic.
A lot of people lost their head.
But democracy in France had a bumpy start, to put it mildly. That's because soon after the revolution, this guy here, Napoleon Bonaparte, seized power and built an empire that included not only France, but also Spain, the Dutch Republic, most of Italy, and Poland. However, perhaps most important of all, his victories in Germany led to the final breakup of the Holy Roman Empire, a state that had existed for over 800 years.
Look at all this stuff just like in this one, like the 19th century is insane.
In its place, the Confederation of the Rhine was created, with Prussia becoming independent and the Habsburg lands becoming the Austrian Empire. Now, obviously, all of the other major powers in Europe were not happy with Napoleon's growing empire.
They had like
and
7
therefore they got
coalitions
together to try and take him down. Between 1792 and 1815, 7 coalitions were formed, some against the French Republic, pre-Napoleon,
and then one against Napoleon,
and some against the French Empire, post-Napoleon.
Yeah.
On this chart, I've combined everything together as the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Basically, this big conflict pitted France against Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia.
And then other small powers that just align themselves depending on who you were with.
And what led to Napoleon's downfall was his failed invasion of Russia in 1812.
Yeah.
By 1815, he was finished, leaving Europe looking very different than it had before he came to power. Let me go from left to right and show you all the changes. First of all, Denmark lost Norway to Sweden, although Norway eventually achieved independence. Great Britain finally merged with Ireland, to form the United Kingdom.
And
And
then you get the Industrial Revolution really beginning in this time as well.
Portugal eventually abolished its monarchy. France initially restored the House of Bourbon before switching to a constitutional monarchy instead, led by a more junior branch of the royal family known as the House of Orleans. But then they got rid of that, establishing another republic, which was then quickly replaced, like last time, with another empire,
With another Napoleon.
this time led by Napoleon III. But then finally, after losing a war with Prussia, they decided to get rid of kings and emperors for good. And
They didn't really decide. They were forced to almost at that point. But yeah, the Third Republic begins, and then France, as we know it, kind of culminates.
and have been a republic ever since.
Pretty much.
In the Low Countries, 3 new countries were formed: Belgium, in what had previously been the Habsburg controlled parts of the area, the Netherlands, in what had previously been the Dutch Republic, and Luxembourg, a very small state that had once been a part of the Holy Roman Empire. Italy remained divided into a bunch of small states, but then through a series of wars eventually united as a single country, led by the House of Savoy, who had previously been kings only of Sardinia. This even included the Papal States, which led to a period in which the Pope refused to leave the Vatican, a situation that was later fixed with the creation of
Vatican City.
Vatican City.
Yeah, it's a funny story.
A similar thing happened in Germany, with all the various independent
Identical
states
thing.
eventually unifying into the German Empire,
Well, they actually create this after the Franco-Prussian War in Versailles.
led by Prussia.
Yeah.
Austria, however, was not invited to join, and therefore they formally merged with Hungary instead, creating Austria-Hungary. Finally, over in the Ottoman Empire, where things had been into
And something not to skip over, Kingdom of Austria was within the Austrian Empire, but they had so much autonomy that they were kind of separate. And I'm guessing, because we really haven't talked about it, did they unify in terms of like a centralized power, or was there still like a Hungarian diet?
decline for quite some time, several countries eventually got their independence, including Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, and Serbia.
19th century just creates a whole new ball game for Europe.
Now, before I move on, I have to point out that the time between the Napoleonic Wars and World War I was also a time of great change in terms of technology.
Yes.
For example, if Napoleon had lived just a few decades longer, we'd probably have a photograph of him today.
Well, we do have his death mask. I mean, that's as good as we got.
You see, it was just after Napoleon that the Industrial Revolution really took off. And by the end of the 19th century, Europe suddenly had railways, electricity, telephones, sewing machines, and much, much more, soon to be followed by things like airplanes and cars. Which brings me to the 2 world wars. World War I, or the Great War as it was called at the time, saw Great Britain and France allied together for the first time ever against both the German Empire and Austria-Hungary. Italy and Russia joined the British-French side, whereas Bulgaria and the Ottomans joined the German side. As I'm sure you know, the British-French side won, which led to the end of the German
Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but you guys that know that you guys already know, so we'll just keep going.
Empire, the abolishing of all the various German monarchies, and the dissolution of Austria-Hungary. Lots of new countries appeared on the map,
Like Soviet Union.
such as a once again independent Hungary, Czechoslovakia, a newly recreated Poland, the Baltic states, although they would soon be absorbed into the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, which was formed by combining Serbia, Croatia, and a few other states, and finally Turkey, due to the end of the Ottoman Empire. Also very important to note is that near the end of World War I, the Russian Revolution took place, resulting in the end of the Russian monarchy. But in Russia, things went in a very different direction. The Russian Empire didn't break up like Austria-Hungary did, but rather reorganized itself as the Soviet Union,
Into Soviets, per se.
which was comprised of a bunch of communist republics, united together under a single leader. Oh, and there was actually at least one more new country that I should point out, Ireland,
Yeah.
which fought for and finally won its independence from the UK, except for Northern Ireland.
Yeah. Because remember that Pale, that whenever they sent colonies, not sorry, they started to populate Northern Ireland. Believe I can't remember who began this, but they began to populate Northern Ireland, and then that population was de facto ethnically English. So this was the compromise.
In Germany, a parliamentary republic was created, but it was very unstable, which of course led to the rise of the dictator Adolf Hitler, who started World War II.
Yep.
This time, Italy was allied with Germany, and together they ended up controlling most of the European continent. Nazi Germany also perpetrated the worst genocide in all of European history, murdering around 7 million Jews. But as I'm sure you know, in the end, Russia and the UK, with the help of the US, defeated Nazi Germany. And therefore, once again, the map of Europe was redrawn.
And redrawn it was for a little bit, and then it would be redrawn again in 1991.
So, after the war, Germany was divided in two, based on which allies controlled which part. West Germany.
And it was actually, I think it was originally drawn into four, and then the United Kingdom, France, and the US merged.
Became a parliamentary republic, whereas East Germany became communist. And not only East Germany, the Soviet Union basically turned Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria into communist states as well, essentially dividing Europe into two parts, with a so-called Iron Curtain down the middle. Take note that post-World War II, Italy, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and eventually Greece all abolished their monarchies. Spain had actually abolished its monarchy before World War II during the dictatorship of
Mr. Franco.
General Franco. But after he died, it was restored. Thus, Europe currently has 7 kingdoms left: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the UK, Spain, Belgium, and the Netherlands,
And Luxembourg.
as well as a few smaller monarchies like Luxembourg.
Yeah.
Now, the most important event in post war Europe was the fall of communism, which led to the
Fall of Soviet Union. Maybe not communism.
reunification of Germany and the breakup of both the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. At this point, lots of new countries were created, such as Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, Ukraine, Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia.
Restored countries too.
Czechoslovakia was also split into Czechia and Slovakia. Okay, the last thing I want to explain is all of these symbols below.
So obviously these symbols mean NATO. I actually don't know what the star means, and then the EU.
Below each country's flag. The first is the blue circle with the compass in it. This indicates which countries are members of NATO, i.e.,
I didn't know Austria wasn't.
the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which also includes the US and Canada. This organization was created soon after World War II, so that if the Soviet Union were to attack any member state, the rest of the members would come to their rescue.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's kind of like the German Confederation, like post Napoleonic War, but much larger scale and much more hot.
However, after the fall of the Soviet Union, most of the former communist countries joined as well. And today, the only major European country that is not a part of NATO is Russia. Ukraine wants to join NATO,
But you don't have it on Austria, which is interesting to me.
but Russia doesn't want this to happen, which is one of the things that led it to invade Ukraine in 2022.
I don't think we need a NATO. I really don't. But it's it it's too far gone. We have to have it at this point until this absolves itself. But NATO should have went away in 1991. I think would have been a much better place.
Resulting in the biggest war in Europe since World War II, and one that is still ongoing.
Yep.
The next symbol, the star, represents which countries are a part of the European Union, or
Really? Okay. I thought this symbol meant that. Or does that mean they use the euro?
EU. The EU isn't a country, but rather a collection of countries that have all agreed to work together, particularly when it comes to economic matters, although its goal is also to promote peace and to ensure human rights.
Interesting, Serbia's not in it. I can understand why Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine's not. But interesting that Serbia's not in it.
Generally speaking, borders are open
Open border, open border. Okay.
between EU countries, allowing citizens to travel freely, although there are a few exceptions.
And obviously Brexit, so they're not in the EU anymore.
Because of Brexit, which is when the UK left the EU, Ireland no longer has an open border with other EU countries, as it has opted to maintain an open border with the UK instead. In addition to this, Norway, Vatican City,
And Ireland's not in NATO? That's interesting as well.
Switzerland, and a few other countries do have an open border with the EU, even though they themselves are not members. Finally, the last symbol represents which countries use the common currency known as the euro. Okay, so that was a look at the last 1,182 years of European history.
1,200 years of European history. Guys, if you are still breathing, how are you doing? You made it through with me? This was fun. It really, I mean, I've been doing YouTube or history YouTube for about a year now, and we've learned a ton of this in this time period. Specifically in 2025, we learned, a lot about the HRE, the Byzantine world, the Russian world, obviously the English and Scandinavian and French worlds, and how all of these things merge together, whether it be through war, politics, alignment, revolution, and so forth. I appreciate you guys alongside me at this entire video. We talked a lot during this video. We're not going to talk a lot at the end. Europe has been awesome. Europe has just been awesome when it comes to the riches it brings to us in terms of wealth and knowledge. It's had a lot of bad spots and calamities, though, with wars and famines and horrendous people that have greedily went to power. But we have to position ourselves towards optimism. Throughout all this history, what did we learn? That's all we got to say. Thank you guys for being here. Peace out. Bye-bye.